Hello, I'm Benjarel Onyama. I am a senior in the Law and Society major, and this is another wonderful day in the Law and Society Honor Society's Career Speaker Series. Today, we are going to happily, wonderfully, so excitedly welcome Mr. Gabriel Escobar. He is the current editor and senior vice president of the Philadelphia Inquirer. And honestly, I don't think anyone really came here to listen to me talk anyway. So I think we should just hand it over and let him say what he has to say. I personally am very excited to hear all about the different places he's worked, such as the Washington Post, and all the different news and journalism stories and events that he's been participating in. So again, thank you so much, Mr. Escobar, and you can take it away.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to speak to you. I actually gain a lot of insights from these kinds of conversations, and they help me, so it's not a one-way thing. I'd like this to be a conversation, which is, the way it's set up. So I'm here to answer, any questions you might have about journalism and reporting as both a craft and a career. And if anyone here has any follow-up questions, please, just reach out to me via email. Gabriel can provide you my contact information. I'm happy to continue those kinds of conversations because, again, they do help me. So some background on me. I was born in Colombia. I spent my first 7 years there in Bogota, the capital. So English is my second language. And if you detect an accent, it's the Queen's accent, and that's Queens, New York, not the House of Windsor. The other salient point to make is that I never, ever aspired to be a journalist, and I sort of backed into this career. I majored in creative writing, and I failed in that career, if that is ever a career. I almost became, of all things, a librarian. I've worked at 7 news organizations, and I started out very small and very modestly at a weekly newspaper in Queens, New York, which is also where I grew up. I'm going to offer some quick observations on journalism. And the aim here is mainly to inspire a kind of conversation. So the first is a simple statement, and there's a lot behind it. The last year has been the most challenging in my career. And I've been at this business for north of 30 years. Journalism has never been more relevant, more important, and more challenged. Journalism and journalists are under assault. The last year has been especially challenging in that regard. It is one of my main worries of the day, every day. More people are reading us, that's the Inquirer, now than ever before. But that hasn't helped the bottom line at all, and that's a significant problem. Reporting on health journalism is more popular and more vital than ever, obviously in part because of what's happened in the last year. Health professionals who are journalists and who write for a mainstream audience, so it's a happy combination of their expertise and a writing style that makes, whatever they write about accessible, are really a hot commodity. The Inquirer regularly publish people who are in the health field who have mastered this kind of writing style. So, I can go on and on with these kinds of observations, but, if it helps, I'd like anyone here to just pick up on anything that I said or anything else, actually, and let's just have that kind of conversation. Do you think that works?
Gabe, I want to go right to it. The last, not only year, but the last 4 years before um, have been challenging for the mainstream media, which Inquirer is. And I want to know how you dealt professionally and personally with the attacks on the ethics and morality of media by the last administration.
Thank you, Evan. Yeah, let me frame it in a longer lens, right? So when you look at public opinion surveys, journalists and journalism don't rank very high, a little above politicians. I think politicians is still in those polls, a little below us. So, the public perception of journalism, has suffered and eroded actually going back many years. And we can't leave out, sort of the responsibility that journalism and journalists themselves have to account for in this sort of public erosion of trust. We're not blameless in this. The last 4 years, however, changed all of that rather dramatically, right? And I remember to this day the first time that I saw a tweet from the President of the United States that called, journalism and journalists enemies of the people. It was a physical reaction, actually. I felt it in my spine because I saw it as such a dangerous thing. And the fact that it became a kind of corrosive, damaging mantra over so many years, has contributed to this great divide out there. The political divisions in the country, have helped fueled, that either distrust or the antagonism of journalists and journalism. But what it has meant in practice is that, journalists are under attack. And for 4 years, those who were bent on attacking journalists had the cover of the highest elected office in the country. So you saw it in ways, large and small. The distrust, a serious issue for us. Some political, explanations there, depending on where you stand in, the political spectrum. Your views, obviously, of journalists and journalism will change. But that was significant. The other one is in sort of a physical exposure, essentially danger in the streets. A level of harassment on social media that is deeply disturbing in general and very damaging to journalists, especially damaging to women journalists, and especially damaging to journalists of color. Right? They are targeted with far more vitriol and sort of personal menace than others. So in practice, this means that we have to come up with all kinds of things that I never thought we would have to. Right? We have a regular communication, for example, with the police department and with Homeland Security, where when we get a direct threat, something that we perceive as a danger to an individual reporter, we have to call the authorities. And journalists do not seek help, easily because we cover the police department, right? So seeking help and protection from the police is not something that we do lightly. We have had to take it seriously. The number of cases that escalate to that level, the call to the police, are not great in number, but they're all very alarming, and they're more frequent now than they were a couple of years ago. So this also attests to the sort of changing environment. In a couple of cases, the police do take this seriously, by the way. And in a handful of cases, they knock on the door of whoever's menacing, and that generally deals with it. Obviously, what happened at the Capitol Gazette in Annapolis a few years ago was something that is in the back of our minds all the time. We now have, when you get off the elevators, when we still had an operating newsroom on 8th and Market, we had to install bulletproof glass again, something that we never really expected. When we covered the protests, either the social justice protests or the protest around the election and the results, the journalists themselves were targeted, right? So we had, if you on social media in those very heated moments, you had people posting photos of Inquirer journalists. We had Inquirer journalists, two women who were excellent at street reporting and especially valiant at covering protests that, presented all kinds of, possible dangers. We had them hounded by a group of Proud Boys who were welcomed at the Fraternal Order of Police headquarters in Northeast Philadelphia. So yeah, that has all changed. We now have to invest in protective gear. Helmets, were not enough. Now we have personally fitted gas masks for reporters who are out on the street covering sort of live events. Newspaper journalists are a little bit protected, and I'm talking more about the scribes because they can blend into a crowd. We have conducted specialized training. It's actually like kind of battlefield training for reporters. Others are much more exposed, right? A photographer carrying all that gear is really exposed. We had, one photographer lost $35,000 worth of equipment in one of these protests last year because she was attacked. So yes, I mean that's a long, detailed answer, but the point to make is that we really are under assault, and I am incredibly proud of the journalists who have carried out their work, even though they realize that in doing so they expose themselves to physical harm and emotional harm.
Bob, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. What you were saying in a way, it's very, very chilling in many, many ways. And journalism was one of sort of two evidence-based, fact-based professions that were under assault over the last 4 years. And, the science and scientists were another group. And of course, they're not out on the street interviewing people and carrying equipment and being physically assaulted. But as an historian of science myself, there's another form of assault. And I think, Evan would appreciate this too. When there's an assault on science and an assault on journalism, what historians think of is an assault on, well, I want to say an assault on democracy, but inversely or differently, an assault on journalism and assault on science simultaneously is the practice of totalitarianism, which is very chilling as well. And I was wondering if you would be willing to speak to that relationship.
And this may strike some as odd, but if you ask me to define journalism, right, I would actually have a hard time because there are so many versions of journalism, and there are so many more now than there were before. And the history of journalism, is one of an evolving profession, that had, some would say, continues to have sort of dark periods, right? I mean, journalism was not always great. The Inquirer has been around since 1829. Modern journalism, from my perspective, began in the 1970s. Before that, you can look at newspapers and and see significant gaps, if not significant omissions, right? So journalism is very hard to define. Now, what I like to do is, I like to narrow the definition, and this is sort of reporting-based journalism, right? So reporting-based journalism is a craft, and it's a craft in the sense that you can go to schools, you can learn how to write a news story. You can learn the fundamentals of journalism. You can take a course on ethics, but in the end, you learn the craft by doing the craft, right? So, I mean, that means that, the journalist himself and herself, the ability, the aptitude evolves over time. And I think people sort of have to recognize that. So fact-based journalism, which is different from opinion, right?
Mhm.
It's different from the vast landscape of journalism, right? Because, there are, there's the kind of journalism that's written with a point of view, and that is journalism.
Mhm.
This is fact-based journalism. And what I try to convey to people who come armed with a bias on what journalism from their perspective is or isn't. What I say is, look, any given day, reporters wake up and they do not have as their primary mission of that day deceiving the public, right? Their primary, first of all, reporters, and I'm talking more specifically about reporters, right? Not editors, not other, professionals in the newsroom. Reporters, it's an ego-driven profession, right? You like the limelight. You like your name at the top of a story. You like doing your job well. You like, more than anything else, working on a really good story, right? And that's what, so, that's the framework of a journalist. That is how I operated when I was a journalist, and I was a reporter for almost 20 years. That's what you want. And then you go after the story, right? And then you build the story. This is the craft part. You gather the ingredients of a story. Either you go to the scene, you talk to people, you read up, whatever it is, right? That's the craft part. You're assembling. And then what I particularly liked was the writing part. And this is because I was a creative writing major. It's the only vestige left, right? Is the actual writing of the story. So there's an art there, and you do that. And then, and this is critical, there's time. Time is friend and enemy, right? You have to write, and as a daily journalist, you have to write well, but write quickly, write before the end of the day. Actually, today, because of digital journalism, it happens now and you write now, right? And then you continue writing, right? So that's the craft, right? So people don't understand. I mean, they gravitate to, their own perceptions on journalism and intent, the intent of the journalist. I always emphasize that I am speaking very specifically about the journalists that we manage here, right? And it is fact-based. You write it, an editor sees it, right? Nothing is published until an editor sees it and reads it. This is not a blog. This is not one person in a basement writing and putting out. This is not, a 140 character story that you just write and put out. These are stories that are vetted. So there is a process, there's a kind of discipline, there's a kind of order, and there are limitations, right?
I have a follow-up on that. There are two areas, at least to me, particularly frustrating regarding fact-based right now. We have a narrative being put out by certain people that the last election was stolen or fraud, which is based on no fact at all. And we have a narrative being put out that that the COVID is a hoax, and to ignore precautions. And as I told you, I'm reading the Inquirer. I know what the Inquirer has been trying to do. How do you deal with the frustration of trying to convince an audience of the facts and the audience rejects it?
Yeah, and this is also critical because for a while, and actually for a long time, journalism was driven by sort of a both sides perspective, and both sides not necessarily meaning just one, right? But a kind of, almost equivalency, this was the first big debate, or the first big one I can think of is on climate change, right? So the evolution of journalism and climate change, where you could say, the climate is changing. Some people say it isn't, and the story flows from there, right? And then at some point, the decision was made, no, climate change is scientifically based. You don't say some people don't believe it to essentially undermine what is recognized by most consensus scientific to be the truth, right? That was a seminal moment in journalism because it began to chip away at this, in some ways justified, but at the end flawed balance and fairness kind of presentation. So you see that, in the two examples that you cited, saying, let me backtrack a little bit because this was also significant. Saying the president of the United States lied, it was a lie, was a major step for institutional journalism, right? And we always avoided that. And you avoided it because you didn't know, that you weren't in the person's head. How could you possibly determine intent, right? But we jumped that wall, right? And it is common, right? In the, election denial, right? You see the phrasing now commonly accepted, false assertions, right? Misleading. I mean, all these labels that are applied by the journalist in the writing. And that is a significant step. Same thing with COVID, same thing with vaccines and, vaccine deniers, now we know that we have a responsibility to, whenever we're writing about vaccines and vaccine deniers, to affirmatively say what is known rather than just leaving the possible misinterpretation by readers that, yes, now that's why I'm a vaccine denier, because it says so, right? So, this is all, in some ways a sign of the evolution of journalism. There's a social justice component here in light of what happened, last year, beginning in June, and there's pressure actually for journalists to, apply that same kind of approach when there are, sort of opposing sides of views to the social, justice conversation that the country is undergoing. And, and that creates, sort of, to some degree, tension within newsrooms. Because for some people, and these are traditional journalists, and in a context, traditional sounds, sort of pejorative, but these are journalists who hew to, certain journalistic principles of fairness and balance, right? And I would argue that fairness and balance, are two qualities that should survive all kinds of pressures. You want stories to be fair and balanced does not mean that kind of moral equivalency that I was just describing. Balance is essentially, if you are writing something that is critical of somebody, something, some company, some individual, you have got to reach out to that person, right? I mean, it's that kind of balance. So, those principles, are in my view, ageless. And there are journalists now within the Inquirer who sort of worry that, this sort of pressure to make journalism more active, threatens to undermine some of those principles.
Ron, you have your hands, and then Mitch afterwards.
Sure, yeah. My question, my wife and I have been talking about this a lot lately, and it applies more to video journalism probably than print, but I think you earlier said that, your readership is up, but you have to worry about the bottom line. And it seems like our observation is that there's more and more sensationalism in the language that's used in the media. And I can only assume that that's to, get viewerships, so everything is breaking news, everything is the extreme. And how do you balance that need to deal with the marketplace, but still have to try to be balanced and neutral?
Right. So sensationalism is an age-old affliction of journalism, and it's what gave birth to yellow journalism and caused the Spanish-American War, among other things. So it is not new. There's a digital version of yellow journalism, which is, the clickbait phenomenon, right? Which thankfully, for most mainstream organizations came and went, and it was an ugly period, right? So here at the Inquirer, just to frame it in local terms, we were not alone here. When with the advent of digital journalism, 1996, some of the people here weren't even born then. 1996, news organizations decided to create a whole separate entity, right? This is the digital journalism part. And it's going to be free, right? A cataclysmic, historically awful decision. Why did they do it? In many places, it was because they didn't want that to be a union shop, right? That's the real reason, right? Washington Post, where I was at the time, that was the driving reason. Same thing with the Inquirer, when it was owned by Knight Ridder, which was the second largest news company in the country after Gannett. So clickbait was based on, you got to bring the audience, because that's the advertising model, right? The more eyeballs you have on digital journalism, the more ads you'll get, the more you'll be able to charge for it. And it created a kind of, bizarre situation where both headlines and the stories themselves were written, to appeal to a mass audience, right? So when you appeal to a mass audience, no insult on mass audiences, you're generally appealing to base instincts, right? And we know where that went. Thankfully, we're no longer there. We are, since September of 2017, we're a subscription model news organization, right? Which is what we have always been, because subscribers were critical to print journalism. Now we're trying to get people to pay for digital journalism, which reverses, the state of play of 2 decades, which was, journalism is free, should be free. Well, no, it can't be free. We have 220 people who work in the Inquirer newsroom, and we got to pay them, right? So yeah, journalism is not free, but subscription-based journalism places a premium on the content. You're not going to pay, for content that you don't value. And if you want clickbait, if you want ugly stuff out there, well, it's a real sewer out there. So you just go out there, you can get it. We are, the model for us really has to be, we have to excel at covering this area, this region, right? If we do that successfully, we will get subscribers. We don't need 3 million subscribers. We don't need 30 million subscribers. We need, for this to be a viable, aggressive news operation, we need, 200, 300,000. That's it. Paying online subscribers. We're at 50 now, by the way. That will produce enough revenue to run, a highly functioning news organization. Now, the model for the Inquirer is different, and actually of interest nationally, because it's funded also by philanthropy. And Philadelphia, for those of you who are natives of Philadelphia, have lived here for a long time, philanthropy is very active in Philadelphia. Some great foundations here civic-minded organizations and people who support, whether it's the art museum, the orchestra, or in this case, journalism. So Jerry Lenfest was the one who started the Lenfest Institute. We are now owned by, a nonprofit institute. And, that has stabilized things. But, to go back to your original question, Ron, yeah, if we go down that road, we're not going to succeed because people will not pay for that. They can get all of that anywhere else. I mean, you can go every day and read the Daily Mail, right? If you haven't read the Daily Mail, look at it. Because, Daily Mail is an incredibly elaborate operation in the United States. This is all clickbait stuff and written in a way that specifically designed to draw large audiences. So when you look at the layout of Daily Mail, it makes no sense. I mean, just look at the headlines. They're all like this long. And that's all because they have mastered, the algorithm. They know that, what they write will draw big audiences. So if you like that kind of stuff, Daily Mail is perfect. You can go to the New York Post, it's kind of the same thing, right? That is not our model. We will not survive with that model.
Rich?
Have you found that future journalists, even some already in the field, have been leaving the profession in the last year or so?
It's sort of, Mitch, it's a complicated picture, and here's why. My sense is that people are really, really interested in journalism as a profession. Journalism programs at universities have evolved significantly, particularly in the past 5 to 10 years. And what that means is that the quality of journalists graduating from journalism school, and this is undergraduate, but also graduate, is far higher than it was before. Journalists are very, very well trained, and they have a lot of experience. Their digital skills are superior. So on the one hand, there's a real talent pool out there. We're lucky here because, there are journalism programs in each of the many universities around, but, Temple is especially excellent at this, and they have a very, very good journalism program. There are other programs elsewhere that are really terrific. I mean, we get, people from across the country. So there is a pipeline coming in. There are more opportunities for journalists coming out of college than there were 10 years ago, because there are so many outlets there. There's so much need for writing and reporting, whether it's a small publication or, major digital publications. So there are job opportunities. People are leaving though. And, you get sort of mid-career people who leave, and they leave, for a variety of reasons, right? Journalism has never been a high-paying field, so that's one reason. The frustration over, what is essentially a 20-decade decline in both news outlets and really mainly print, and simple and newsroom slots, right? So to put it in the Inquirer perspective, in the mid-90s and probably up until 2000, this newsroom had north of 700 journalists. And as I said before, it's now 210. So, there are professionals who essentially got tired and fed up with, managing decline. And those people, some people have left. A lot of people have remained though. And, that does speak to, sort of the passion that journalists have for the job, right? I mean, it is a rewarding profession in the sense that, if you are good, you will see your work not only circulate, but in some instances, create change. I mean, and that does happen, and it happens in very small ways and in large ways.
Gabe, are you concerned with the corporatization of news? And what I mean by that is certain corporations are buying up newspapers around the country, whether it's local news or print news. And how does that affect getting different points of view out that are not from corporation, but rather from different sources?
Right. So ownership has always been, an issue, and it has, and you can't deny that it's affected the journalism. So again, at the Inquirer, there's a famous case when Walter Annenberg owned the newspaper, and he's the one who sold it to Knight Ridder. So he owned it. It was actually his father, Moses Annenberg, who started out with the racing form, for those of you who are horse people. It made him fabulously wealthy, and then Reader's Digest and all that. So that's the roots of that empire. So when Walter Annenberg was the publisher of the Inquirer, he hated the owner of the 76ers, and he mandated that the Inquirer never write about the 76ers and only run the little score data from each game, right? So there's the publisher essentially, acting by fiat and damaging the journalism in this case. There are, and have been, for the last 15 years, venture capitalists who have done great damage to journalism. And Alden Capital is famous for this. And Alden Capital owned the Inquirer for a handful of years, beginning in 2010, I think. And, they essentially, they're vulture capitalists, right? So how did that play out here? Well, the first thing they did was they sold the Inquirer building on Broad and Callow Hill for, I don't know, $25 million, right? So they came in, put the building on the market and cashed in, that kind of thing. Alden is a major player, although it looks like they may not win out in the bid for the Chicago Tribune. So yes, there's that kind of corporate ownership. I'm sure if you went back and looked at Knight Ridder and Gannett, both of those companies at their height owned hundreds of television newspapers, dozens of television stations, radio stations. So these were major corporate organizations. To the extent that they were able to manage, manipulate, influence the news, that was also the height of the power of the editor, right? Because editors were notorious in sort of whatever corporate structure you worked in, because they didn't listen. They didn't hew to the corporate masters. They were independent actors who pretty much did what they wanted to do. Hopefully, and generally this was the case with journalism and high journalism principles, right? So, whether it's Ben Bradley at the Washington Post, or, the Inquirer editors here, because they were rostered really luminaries, or, the people at the New York Times, they ran their own shops. So, how that played out in other places, I'm not as familiar. The smaller the newspaper, the more challenging that can be. If you look at in Pennsylvania, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette is owned by a family, right? And there've been issues there because the family essentially imposes itself. So people who work in those news organizations have to essentially come to terms with that. And people have left papers like that because of the positions that are imposed. So it's a mixed landscape, I think.
I have a question actually to follow that up. Sorry, did I just interrupt someone?
Go ahead, Karen.
Okay. So I recently had to write a report about like disappearances of journalists and like the situation of free press in like Latin America and China and areas like that. And I wanted to know if you had any insight as to sort of like what influences like anti-press violence in areas like that, and if you think there are ways to amend it, because a lot of what I read about focused a lot on like a feeling by journalists that like their higher ups sort of didn't listen to them as far as like feeling unsafe or feeling targeted and like attacked in their field. So I just wanted to know if you had any insight on that situation.
Yeah, I mean, for all I said at the beginning of this about how dangerous it is to be, sort of a journalist working the streets, it is not anything remotely compared to either a war scenario, which introduces a whole bunch of other menaces, or, the situation faced in, let's say Mexico or Colombia in the height of the drug wars, or in many other places where the press doesn't have the protections and the worst outcome, the systemic assassination of journalists happens. If you're if you're a journalist in Mexico and you're writing about the cartels there, same thing in Colombia, less so now, more so in the 80s and 90s, you were in danger and you saw people killed. I mean, it was as simple as that. You did your job. You either had to run and hide, and many Colombian journalists had to flee Colombia in the late 80s and early 90s at the height of this. And in Mexico, the same thing has happened. They are killed for doing their work. What kind of protections? The only, there's the kind of scrutiny that, the international associations for journalists bring, that can only get you so far. The State Department, historically has been sort of very aggressive in advocating for freedom of the press and protection of journalists. And, that happens both, sort of globally out of, the State Department and Foggy Bottom, but depending on the embassies, that could be done at the local level. So, the ambassadors, the US ambassadors, in Mexico and Colombia and in other places, Central America also, where there's the physical harm to journalists, and then there's the oppressive control of the press. And both of those are obviously really, really corrosive. And again, there's only so much that can be done.
I have one last question, Gabe. The Dominion lawsuit against Fox News for the false story about the election. Do you see any blowback to the profession as a result of it?
I don't think so, and for the reason that when you look at the Dominion lawsuit, it's what Fox and actually other outlets did that was so egregious. I mean, it was, in some ways it was sort of journalistic malpractice. And I don't say that lightly. The fact that, Fox, after the first threat of a lawsuit, not the actual filing of a lawsuit, essentially addressed on air their own shortcomings, just shows how grave a journalistic misstep that was. So I don't think so in that regard. It's always, it's always challenging when news organizations are sued, but it's just sort of a fact of life. It doesn't happen every day that, we get a menacing letter, but it does happen. And we have in-house legal counsel, and we have two law firms that we seek out depending on, what the case before us is. But, and we have, liability insurance too, and libel insurance. So, it's just a fact of life. In the case of Dominion, I don't think it'll have, far-reaching consequences because it was sort of an unusual case.
Does anyone have any? Oh, Benji, go right ahead.
Yes, so I do have a question for you, Mr. Escobar. So because we are a group of students, the whole point of the Honor Society and the speaker series is to get students either more information in career fields they're already looking into, or to open their minds to options that they were not considering previously. So as a seasoned journalist, I would like to know if you have advice on anyone interested in journalism on how to get into the field as someone who's young, maybe still in college, fresh out of college. What would you suggest are some steps that they can take to kind of get their foot in the door?
So, and this is a question that's asked of me often. Right. That's the answer, right? If you're in college and you're interested in journalism, you write. You find your college paper, talk to Mitch, and write. You know, to the extent that your university offers coursework in journalism, obviously take that. But I have always valued the experience that college journalism gives, you know, students, because it is, I mean, it's not a facsimile of the profession. It is the profession. You're actually out there writing and reporting, and it is of high value. You know, a lot of the interns that we have and have had over time, you know, I would say most of them, you know, have worked for their college newspaper and have had leadership positions in the college newspaper. And that really is invaluable. And some of the college newspapers are, you know, significant enterprises. I mean, you know, the Collegian at Penn State publishes every day. I mean, you're managing a staff of, you know, dozens and dozens of people. So these are serious jobs, and not only do they provide training, they allow you to sort of see what the profession is like in real life. So journalism is a little different from other professions in that way. The other thing that is key is internships, right? Internships in news organizations, you know, build off what you learn in college, and again, put you in a professional setting. This year, sadly, and last year too, we didn't have the normal internship class. We usually have, you know, about between 20 and 25 every summer, and they're paid. It's paid internships, and they're highly competitive. So for the 20 or 25 that we had, last full class was 2019. I think we had 800 applicants or something. So these are highly competitive jobs. And what I tell those interns when they begin, it's usually June through mid-August, you know, I say the one thing that distinguishes your internship here from many other internships is that you're a professional journalist right here, right now, right? When you write a story for the Inquirer, it has your name and it says staff writer. There's no asterisk. There's nothing that says you're an intern. You are a working journalist, and that's different.
That's a good place to end. I want to thank you very much. I'll call you now Mr. Escobar at the end. Thank you for the Philadelphia Inquirer's excellence. It is appreciated by the city of Philadelphia and myself. We're going to stop the recording. If you could stay on just a second, I just have a couple of questions for you off the air. Thank you so much to the Honor Society for setting this up. This was terrific.